The cold was a thief. It stole the feeling from her fingers and the strength from her bones. Here, in the northernmost village of Griff, a place that felt more like the world's frozen edge than a part of any kingdom, the cold was a constant, living thing. For Ilara, it was more than just weather. It was a sentence. She pulled her threadbare cloak tighter, the rough wool scratching at her chin. The wind sliced through the gaps in the fabric like claws of ice, a familiar predator. It always found the weakest spots. On the back of her right hand, the brand throbbed with a cold of its own. A swirling, ugly knot of black ink that marked her as a criminal, a thief. The magistrate had pressed the searing iron into her skin himself, his face impassive as she screamed. She hadn't stolen the grain. She had been taking a small portion to a sick widow, a portion the village elders had already declared spoiled and unfit. But her accuser had been the son of a councilman, and she was an orphan with no one to speak for her. The brand was a lie burned into her flesh. It had been 5 years. The physical burn had healed, but the mark remained, a source of phantom aches that worsened with the winter chill. It was a constant reminder of her worthlessness. No one looked at her face anymore. They saw the brand and saw a thief. They saw weakness. They saw something to be used or discarded. Her stomach twisted with a familiar, hollow ache. She hadn't eaten in 2 days. The baker had chased her away that morning, waving a broom and shouting about filth. Her coins, earned from mending fishing nets with numb fingers, were apparently not good enough for his bread. She was invisible until someone needed a target for their cruelty. A commotion at the village gate drew her from her miserable reverie. A horseman, clad in dark furs and bearing the silver wolf sigil of the Alpha King's personal guard, was speaking to the village elder. Even from across the square, the tension was a palpable thing, a tightening in the frigid air. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. Royal guards never came this far north, not unless something was wrong. Then she saw him. Riding behind the guard on a jet-black destrier was a man whose face made her blood run even colder than the wind. Lord Valerius, the king's chief advisor, and the uncle of the boy who had accused her. Valerius had been there the day she was branded. He had watched, his thin lips pressed into a faint, satisfied smile. He had been visiting his sister, the councilman's wife, and had made a point to attend the dispensing of justice. He had looked at her, not with anger, but with a chilling sort of appraisal, as if she were an insect he had decided to crush under his boot. It was his quiet word to the magistrate that had sealed her fate. Fear, sharp and absolute, pierced through the dull fog of hunger and cold. He was here. Why was he here? It didn't matter. If he saw her, if he remembered her, she was finished. An outcast was one thing. A branded criminal who had caught the advisor's eye was another. He would not tolerate such a loose end. She didn't think. She just moved. Keeping her head down, her branded hand tucked deep into the folds of her cloak, she slipped away from the square. She moved through the narrow, filthy alleys between the huts, her bare feet numb against the frozen mud. Panic was a hot spike in her throat. She couldn't stay here. He would find her. There was only one direction to run. West, into the Whispering Woods. Everyone in Griff knew the stories. The woods were the Alpha King's private domain, a cursed, perpetually frozen forest where the snow never fully melted, even in the height of summer. They said the king himself was a monster, more wolf than man. They said his own wolf, a separate savage beast, roamed the woods. "The Alpha King's wolf hasn't let anyone live," the elders would whisper by the fire. Poachers who ventured in were never seen again. Lost children were found in pieces or not at all. It was a place of certain death. But Valerius was certain death too. A slower, more deliberate kind. The beast in the woods might be quick. The choice was not a choice at all. It was an escape. She reached the edge of the village, the last hovel giving way to the first line of skeletal, snow-dusted pines. The air here was different. Colder, yes, but also heavier. Quieter. The normal sounds of the forest were absent. No birds, no scurrying animals. Just the sound of the wind moving through the high branches, a sound like a long, drawn-out sigh. She glanced back one last time. She saw Valerius dismount, his dark cloak swirling around him like a shadow. His gaze swept the square, and for a terrifying second, she felt as if his eyes met hers, even from that distance. She didn't wait. She plunged into the trees. The snow was deeper here, reaching her knees in places. Each step was a struggle, a fight against the grasping cold. The trees grew thick and close, their branches heavy with ice, blocking out the weak afternoon light. The world became a maze of white and gray. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs screamed in protest. The panic subsided, replaced by the sheer exhausting effort of survival. She stumbled, fell, and pushed herself back up, her hands raw and bleeding from scraping against ice-crusted bark. The cold was relentless, seeping through her clothes, into her muscles, into her very marrow. She had no idea how long she had been running. An hour? 2? The light began to fail, the gray world dimming to black. She was hopelessly lost. The village was gone. Her past was gone. There was only the snow and the cold and the crushing silence. Her body was failing. Her movements became clumsy, her thoughts sluggish. The hollow ache in her stomach was a roaring fire of need, but there was nothing to feed it. She stumbled one last time, her leg catching on a hidden root. She fell face first into a deep drift of snow. It was so soft, so quiet. She tried to push herself up, but her arms wouldn't obey. The cold had stolen the last of her strength. This was it then. This was how it ended. Not by a beast's claws, but by the quiet, indifferent cold. It was almost peaceful. She closed her eyes. The pain in her branded hand faded. The hunger faded. Everything was just fading. A sound broke the silence, a soft crunching of snow. Her eyes fluttered open. It was too dark to see clearly, but a shape was resolving itself from the shadows. It was huge, far bigger than any wolf she had ever seen or heard of. It was the size of a pony, its body a mass of thick, silver-white fur that seemed to drink the moonlight. This was it, the beast. It padded closer, its movements silent and fluid despite its size. It stopped a few feet from her, its head lowered. 2 eyes gleamed in the darkness, not with feral fire, but with a strange, cold light. They were the color of ice, of a winter sky, and they stared at her with an unnerving intelligence. This was the creature of nightmare and legend, the wolf that let no one live. Ilara held her breath, waiting for the teeth, for the tearing pain. She was too weak to even scream. The beast took another step. It lowered its massive head and nudged her shoulder with its nose. The touch was surprisingly gentle. A puff of its breath washed over her face, misting in the air, but it wasn't hot like a living creature's breath should be. It was cool, like the air from a deep cave. It nudged her again, more insistently this time. Then its gaze dropped to her hand, half buried in the snow, the one with the brand. It let out a low, guttural sound, not a growl of aggression, but something else, something she couldn't decipher. With a gentleness that defied its monstrous form, it used its snout to push her hand free of the snow. It stared at the ugly black mark for a long moment. Ilara's heart pounded a weak, frantic rhythm. She thought it might bite her hand off. Instead, it did something utterly baffling. It opened its massive jaws, but not to bite. It carefully, delicately, gripped the thick fabric of her tunic at the scruff of her neck. She felt a brief, sharp pressure, and then she was lifted from the snow as easily as a pup. She dangled from its mouth, her body limp and unresisting. Terror warred with utter confusion. It wasn't killing her, it was carrying her. The wolf turned and began to move deeper into the woods, its stride long and impossibly smooth. The world was a dizzying blur of white and black. The motion should have been jarring, but it wasn't. She was held securely, cradled almost. The cold of the air was still sharp, but where her back pressed against the wolf's broad chest, there was a strange lack of it. Not warmth, but a deep, resonant stillness, like the heart of a glacier. She didn't know where it was taking her. To a den to be devoured later? To its master? Her exhausted mind couldn't form a coherent thought. She could only feel the gentle sway of its walk, see the cold light of its eyes whenever it glanced down, and feel the phantom ache of the brand on her hand, a cold that seemed to call out to the deeper cold of the beast itself. The last thing she saw before the darkness claimed her completely was the silhouette of a castle against the moonlit sky. A fortress of black stone and ice-spired towers, rising from the heart of the frozen woods like a shard of night. She woke to the crackle of a fire. For a moment she was disoriented, her mind still lost in the frozen dark of the forest. But the air was warm. The surface beneath her was soft. She was lying in a bed, a real bed, piled high with thick fur blankets. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, a roaring blaze within it casting flickering shadows across the room. The room itself was vast and baronial. Tapestries depicting ancient hunts hung on the stone walls, their colors faded with age. The ceiling soared high overhead, lost in shadow. It was a room built for a giant, a king. Panic, cold and sharp, returned. She sat up, her heart pounding. Where was she? Where was the wolf? It is gone. The voice came from the shadows near the window. It was deep, resonant, like the rumble of distant thunder. A man stepped forward into the firelight. He was immense, taller than any man she had ever seen, with shoulders so broad they seemed to strain the seams of his simple black tunic. His hair was the color of midnight, long and unbound, falling around a face that was all harsh lines and sharp angles. It was a predator's face, beautiful in the way a storm was beautiful, powerful, merciless, and utterly untamed. But it was his eyes that stole her breath. They were the same eyes as the wolf. The same impossible, luminous silver gray, like chips of ice reflecting a winter moon. They held the same unnerving intelligence, the same profound cold. This was the Alpha King, Kale. She scrambled back against the headboard, pulling the furs up to her chin like a shield. Her mind reeled. The wolf, the king, they were one and the same. The legends were true. He didn't move closer. He simply stood there, watching her, his expression unreadable. His presence filled the room, a heavy, silent pressure that was more intimidating than any threat. "You were freezing to death in my forest," he stated. It wasn't a question. My wolf was not inclined to let that happen. His wolf. He spoke of it as if it were a separate being, a willful companion rather than a part of himself. Why? The word was a dry whisper scratching her throat. The stories. They say it kills everyone. A flicker of something, not quite amusement but a shadow of it, crossed his face. The stories are not always wrong, but with you it chose differently. I do not know why. He took a step closer and she flinched. He stopped immediately. A long silence stretched between them, thick with her fear and his unnerving stillness. She could feel the cold radiating from him, a palpable aura that seemed to dim the firelight. What are you going to do with me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Nothing," he said, and the word was so flat, so final it was more terrifying than a threat. "You will stay here. You will be given food and shelter. You will not leave this room without my permission." I'm a prisoner. You are a curiosity my wolf refuses to part with, he corrected, his voice devoid of emotion. It has never brought anyone back alive. It has never shown restraint. Until you. His gaze drifted to her right hand, which was clenched in the fur blanket. Let me see it. It wasn't a request. It was a command, spoken softly but with an absolute authority that sent a shiver down her spine. Hesitantly, she unfurled her fingers, revealing the ugly black brand. He stared at it, his silver eyes narrowing. He didn't move, but she felt his focus on the mark like a physical touch. A thief's brand. I didn't do it, she whispered, the old, useless defense falling from her lips before she could stop it. It does not matter, he said, his gaze lifting back to her face. Your past is of no concern to me. You are here now. That is all. He turned and walked to the door. There is food on the table, clothes in the chest. Do not try to leave. With that, he was gone, the heavy oak door closing behind him with a dull, final thud. She was alone. Alone in a gilded cage, the ward of a monster king who looked at her as if she were a strange insect trapped under glass. The days that followed blurred into a strange, timeless routine. She was a ghost in a silent castle. She ate the food that was left for her, wore the simple but warm woolen dresses she found in the chest, and stared out the tall, arched window at the endless, snow-covered forest. She never saw any servants. The food, always hot and plentiful, appeared on the table by the door as if by magic. The fire was always banked, the room always warm. It was a strange, lonely sort of care. And every night, he came. He would enter the room without a sound, a shadow detaching itself from other shadows. He wouldn't speak. He would simply stand by the cold hearth or by the window, watching her. Sometimes for minutes, sometimes for an hour. His stillness was unnerving. He barely seemed to breathe. She would lie in her bed pretending to be asleep, her entire body rigid with tension, feeling his icy gaze on her. She didn't understand what he wanted. He seemed as confused by her presence as she was. He was drawn to her for a reason he couldn't comprehend, and it seemed to frustrate him. One night, a week into her captivity, a nightmare clawed its way out of her memory. She was back in the village square, the smell of burning flesh in the air. The magistrate's hot iron descended and she screamed, thrashing in the bed tangled in the furs. A hand clamped down on her shoulder, a cold hand. So cold it felt like being touched by a statue carved from ice. Her eyes flew open. Kale was leaning over her, his face inches from hers. Concern, or something that looked like it, was etched on his harsh features. You were dreaming, he said, his voice a low rumble. She was panting, tears streaming down her face. Without thinking, she clutched at his arm, her fingers brushing the bare skin of his forearm. It was shockingly, unnaturally cold. He flinched back as if she had burned him. He stared at his arm, then at her, a look of profound shock on his face. What? You're so cold, she whispered, her own fear momentarily forgotten in the face of this strange reality. It wasn't just his aura, his very skin was like ice. He didn't answer. He just stared at her, his silver eyes wide with something she couldn't name. Then he turned and swept from the room, leaving her alone with the echo of his chilling touch and 1,000 unanswered questions. After that night, things changed. The boundary between them, the wall of his cold silence, began to crack. He still came at night, but now he would speak. His questions were simple, hesitant. What was her name? Where did she come from? He never asked about the brand again. She answered in quiet, clipped sentences, still terrified of him, but a strange sort of familiarity was growing in the space between them. She found herself watching him too. She saw the way frost would sometimes form on the stone floor around his feet if he stood still for too long. She saw the faint blue tinge to his lips that he tried to hide. The cold he radiated wasn't just a part of his power, it was a sickness, a blight that lived inside him. One evening, she took a smooth, flat stone from the hearth, warmed by the fire until it was almost too hot to touch. She wrapped it in a piece of cloth and, before she got into bed, placed it on the floor just inside the door. A small, foolish gesture, a peace offering to a monster. That night when he came, he paused just inside the door. She watched through her lashes as he looked down at the wrapped stone. He didn't pick it up. He just stood over it for a long time. When he finally moved to his usual spot by the window, she thought she saw the rigid line of his shoulders relax. Just a fraction. The next morning, the stone was gone. He started bringing her things. A book of old legends with beautiful illustrations. A single, perfect white rose he must have found in a hidden conservatory, its petals impossibly soft. A small carved wooden wolf that fit in the palm of her hand. He never said anything when he gave them to her. He would just place them on the table and leave. But they were messages. They said, "I see you. You are not just a curiosity." She was falling. Not in love, not yet. That was an impossible, terrifying thought. But she was falling into a kind of dependence, a strange sympathy for the cold, lonely king who was as much a prisoner in this castle as she was. She was beginning to see the man behind the monster, the profound loneliness in his icy eyes. And that, she knew, was the most dangerous thing of all. The fragile peace of her strange existence was shattered by the sound of a horn at the castle gates. Ilara was by the window, tracing the patterns of frost on the glass. The sound, sharp and clear in the frozen air, made her jolt. It was the same sigil call she had heard in the village. The king's guard. A knot of dread tightened in her stomach. Visitors were a complication she hadn't considered. In her isolated world with Kyle, she had almost forgotten the existence of anyone else. An hour later, Kale entered her room. It was the middle of the day, the first time he had come to her in the light since her arrival. His face was a mask of cold fury. The air in the room dropped several degrees. "Lord Valerius is here," he said, his voice clipped. "He is my chief advisor. He will not know of your presence. You are to remain in this room. You will not make a sound." Valerius. The name was a physical blow. The man from her past, the architect of her ruin, was here, in this castle. The fragile safety of her cage evaporated, leaving her exposed and terrified. He's the one who... She started, her voice shaking. "I know." Kyle cut her off, his silver eyes flashing. "You told me the story of your branding. I know who he is to you." He took a step closer, and for the first time, she felt a wave of protectiveness from him, a stark contrast to his usual distance. "He will not harm you. I will not allow it." The words were a balm on her raw fear. "I will not allow it." A simple declaration, but from him, it was an unbreakable vow. She nodded, unable to speak. He left, and the silence he left behind was heavier than ever. She could hear the faint murmur of voices from the great hall below, the sharp, oily tones of Valerius and Kale's deep, rumbling responses. She pressed her ear to the floor, trying to make out the words, but they were indistinct. The next day, the door to her room opened, but it wasn't Kale. It was Lord Valerius. He stood in the doorway, a smug, predatory smile on his thin face. He was dressed in opulent black and silver furs, a stark contrast to Kale's simple attire. His eyes, small and dark, raked over her, taking in the warm room, the fine wool dress she wore. "Well, well," he said, his voice dripping with condescending surprise. "The little thief from Griff. I must say, you've landed on your feet." Ilara scrambled back, her heart seizing in her chest. "How did you know I was here?" The king may be a beast, but his castle still has servants loyal to a more sensible authority, Valerius purred, stepping into the room. They tell me the king's pet wolf brought a stray back to its lair. I had to see for myself. He prowled around the room, his gaze lingering on the book, the dead rose in a vase, the small wooden wolf on her nightstand. He's given you gifts. How touching. He has never shown such favor to anyone. His eyes narrowed. This is a complication. He is meant to be alone, isolated. His condition makes him malleable. But this? He gestured around the room, at her. This is a variable I cannot permit. What condition? She demanded, finding a sliver of courage in her fear for Kale. Valerius laughed, a dry, rattling sound. You mean you haven't figured it out? You who sleeps under his roof? The great Alpha King is dying, little thief. His bloodline is cursed. An ancient sin that fills the Alpha with a winter that cannot be thawed. It consumes him, piece by piece, until his heart freezes solid. His wolf fights it, which is why it is so savage. It is a beast in constant agony. The truth of his words hit her with the force of a physical blow, the unnatural cold, the frost at his feet, the way he flinched from her touch. It all made a terrible, horrifying sense. He grows colder, Valerius continued, his eyes gleaming with triumph. Weaker. Soon the throne will require a new, stronger hand to guide it. My hand. And you are a threat to that. A distraction. A potential cure, if the old legends are to be believed. A fire to thaw the ice. He sneered. But you are no queen. You are a branded stray. The door flew open, slamming against the stone wall with a crack like thunder. Kale stood there, his body vibrating with a rage so profound it was terrifying to behold. The temperature in the room plummeted. Frost spiderwebbed out from his boots across the floor. Valerius! He snarled. The name was a death sentence. Valerius held up his hands in mock surrender, his smile never wavering. Your Majesty, I was merely checking on the guest, ensuring she was not a threat. She is under my protection, Kyle growled, moving to stand between Alara and the advisor. His sheer size was a wall of fury. You will not come near her again. You will not speak to her again. Do you understand me? Perfectly, Your Majesty, Valerius said, bowing low. My apologies. I was only thinking of your well-being. He backed out of the room, his dark eyes lingering on Alara for a moment with a look of pure hatred. The moment he was gone, Kale swayed. He braced a hand against the wall, a shudder running through his massive frame. A gasp of pain escaped his lips. Kale! Ilara rushed to his side, her fear for herself forgotten. She reached for him, but he jerked away. Don't! He choked out. Don't touch me. She could see it now, clear as day. A fine layer of frost was creeping up his neck, glistening on his skin. His veins stood out, dark blue beneath the surface. The curse. It was active, consuming him. He's trying to kill you, she whispered in horror. He is merely impatient, Kale ground out, straightening with a monumental effort of will. He wouldn't look at her. The shame and vulnerability radiating from him were a palpable agony. The cold. It is worse than it has been in a long time. His presence agitates it. He looked at her then, his silver eyes filled with a storm of conflicting emotions. Fear, longing, and a profound, heartbreaking loneliness. He is right about one thing, he said, his voice barely a whisper. You are a distraction. A dangerous one. He turned and left, leaving her shivering in the sudden, oppressive cold, the truth of his curse settling like a shroud over her heart. He was dying. And the man who wanted him dead now knew she was here. A blizzard descended that night, a howling monster of wind and snow that threw itself against the castle walls. It was as if the unnatural winter of the land had focused all its fury on this single point. The storm was a reflection of the turmoil inside the castle, of the battle raging within its king. Alara couldn't sleep. She paced her room, the furs wrapped tightly around her, but the chill she felt had nothing to do with the temperature. It was the ice of fear. Valerius's words echoed in her mind. A fire to thaw the ice. What did it mean? Was she truly some prophesied cure? Or was it just another of the advisor's cruel manipulations? Around midnight, a scream tore through the castle. Not a human scream, but a sound of pure animalistic agony, followed by a deafening crash. It was Kale. She didn't hesitate. She threw open her door and ran. The corridors were frigid, torches guttering in a supernatural wind that seemed to blow from within the castle itself. She followed the sounds of destruction to the great hall. The scene was one of chaos. A massive table had been overturned. Tapestries were ripped from the walls. And in the center of the room, Lord Valerius stood with 2 guards, a triumphant sneer on his face. On the floor before him lay Kale. He was on his hands and knees, his body racked with violent shudders. But it wasn't Kale the man. His form was twisted, caught halfway between human and wolf. One arm was elongated, covered in silver fur and ending in black claws that scraped against the stone. His face was a contorted mask of pain, fangs bared in a silent snarl, and he was freezing. A thick shell of crystalline ice was encasing him, starting from his limbs and creeping inward. It crawled across his skin like a living thing, glistening and malevolent. He was being frozen alive from the inside out. "It seems the king's time has come to an end," Valerius announced to the terrified guards who were huddled by the doors. "His curse has finally claimed him. A tragedy." His voice held no trace of sadness, only victory. "As his appointed advisor, I am now regent of this kingdom. Seize the girl. She is a spy who hastened his demise with her dark magic." The 2 guards with Valerius advanced on her, but Alara didn't see them. She only saw Kale, trapped and dying. The bond she hadn't known how to name, the fragile connection forged in quiet nights and unspoken gestures, screamed in her soul. It was a physical pain, a tearing in her chest. "No," she whispered. "Seize her," Valerius commanded. As the guards reached for her, something inside Alara broke. The fear, the helplessness, the years of being worthless and discarded, coalesced with the fierce, desperate love she now realized she felt for the dying king. It ignited. "Get away from him," she said. Her voice didn't tremble. It was low, resonant, filled with a power she had never known she possessed. The guards hesitated, taken aback by the sudden force in her demeanor. She walked forward, past them, her eyes locked on Kale's agonizing, frozen form. The ice had reached his chest now, creeping toward his heart. His breathing was a shallow, rattling gasp. "It's over, little thief," Valerius spat. "There's nothing you can do. He is gone." She knelt beside Kale. She could feel the waves of absolute cold pouring off him, a cold that felt like death itself. She could feel his life force, his very spirit, being extinguished. She remembered the first night, how he had flinched from her touch. She remembered the warmth she had felt, a tiny spark against his glacial skin, a fire to thaw the ice. It wasn't a legend. It was her. She placed a hand on his shoulder, on the part of him that was still flesh. The cold was excruciating, a searing pain that shot up her arm, but she didn't pull away. She leaned in close, her lips near his ear, her tears falling onto the spreading ice. "I will not let you go," she whispered, the words a vow, a prayer, a command. "Do you hear me, Kale? You are not allowed to die." She placed her other hand on his chest, directly over his heart. She closed her eyes and focused, not on the cold, but on the feeling she had for him. the fierce, protective warmth that bloomed in her chest, the anger at Valerius, the desperate, burning need for Kale to live, to be whole. She pushed that feeling into her hands. She poured all of her love, all of her rage, all of her very soul into him. For a moment, nothing happened. The cold bit deeper. The ice continued to spread. Despair threatened to swallow her. Then it began. A faint golden light flickered under her palms. The brand on her hand, the ugly black mark of the thief, began to glow. It wasn't the red of a hot iron, but the pure, white gold light of a star. The ink sizzled, not burning her skin, but dissolving, turning from a mark of shame into a font of power. A wave of heat erupted from her, so intense it was like standing in the heart of a forge. It wasn't a fire that burned, but a pure, life-giving warmth. The golden light exploded outward, engulfing them both, pushing back the shadows and the storm. The ice on Kyle's body didn't melt, it shattered. It exploded away from him in a shower of glittering dust, hissing as it touched the superheated air. The half-wolfen features receded, his body relaxing back into its human form. The monstrous tension left him, replaced by a deep, shuddering breath. The guards cried out in shock and fell to their knees. Valerius staggered back, his face a mask of disbelief and horror. No, it's not possible. The prophecy was a myth. Alara didn't hear him. She was lost in the torrent of power flowing from her, a roaring river of liquid sunlight that poured into Kale, chasing away the ancient cold, warming the frozen blood in his veins, reigniting the dying embers of his heart. She felt his life connect with hers, a bond of fire and ice, of wolf and sun, forging itself into something new and unbreakable. The light receded, drawing back into her until it was just a soft glow emanating from her hands. The brand on her own hand was gone. In its place, the skin was clean, unblemished, and humming with a gentle warmth. Kale gasped, a deep, shuddering inhalation of warm air. His eyes, which had been squeezed shut in agony, slowly opened. They were no longer the cold, silver gray of a winter sky. They were the color of molten gold. He looked up at her, his gaze filled with awe, with recognition, with a love so profound it made her heart ache. He reached up, his hand, now warm for the first time in centuries, cupping her cheek. His touch was no longer the shock of ice, but the steady heat of a hearth fire. You, he breathed, the word a reverent prayer. He pulled her down, his arms wrapping around her, holding her tight against his chest. She could feel the strong, steady beat of his heart against her ear. A heart that was no longer freezing. I have you, she whispered into his tunic, her body trembling with the aftermath of the power that had flowed through her. Always, he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. He looked over her head at the stunned hall. His gaze fell on Valerius, who was trying to slip away toward a side door. Kale's voice, when he spoke, was not the growl of a beast or the rumble of a distant king. It was the clear, commanding tone of a man made whole. Jailer. The guards, who had been kneeling in awe, scrambled to their feet. They seized the treacherous advisor, who sputtered and protested, his face pale with terror. "This is treason!" Valerius shrieked. "The girl is a witch! She has enchanted him!" Kyle rose to his feet, pulling Alara up with him. He never let her go, keeping one arm securely around her waist. He looked down at the struggling advisor with eyes of burning gold. "She is my queen," he said, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "And you have spent a lifetime trying to murder your king. You will spend the rest of your short life in the deepest, coldest cell in this castle. Perhaps you will learn what true cold feels like." The guards dragged Valerius away, his cries echoing and then fading down the stone corridor. Silence descended on the great hall. It was a new kind of silence, not the heavy, oppressive silence of a cursed place, but the peaceful quiet of a sanctuary. The blizzard outside had ceased. Through the tall windows, the first rays of dawn were breaking, tinting the snow-covered world in hues of pink and gold. Cale turned his full attention back to her. He gently took her hand, the one that had borne the brand, and raised it to his lips. He kissed the clean, smooth skin. The prophecy spoke of a mate with the fire of a dragon's heart, born under a dark sign that was not her own, he said, his voice soft. I thought it was a fairy tale, a cruel hope. My line was cursed by a sorcerer my ancestor wronged, condemned to feel the world freeze around us until our own hearts turned to ice. He looked into her eyes, and she saw centuries of loneliness, of pain, of cold, finally melting away. I was wrong. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was you. You were always you. I didn't know, she whispered. The power. I never felt it before. It was sealed, he said, touching her forehead gently. Sealed by the same magic that branded you, I'd wager. A suppression spell, meant to keep you hidden, worthless. It could only be broken by an act of absolute love, or absolute defiance. He smiled, a true, warm smile that transformed his harsh face into something breathtakingly beautiful. I believe you managed both. He drew her closer, his forehead resting against hers. They said my wolf never let anyone live. They were right. It was searching. For centuries, it has been searching for the one soul whose warmth could quiet its pain. It didn't let anyone live, because none of them were you. She looked up at him, at this magnificent man who was no longer a monster, no longer a beast of ice and shadow. She saw her home in his golden eyes. And now? Now, he said, his voice dropping to a husky whisper that sent a shiver of warmth through her. Now we live. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of desperation or gratitude. It was a kiss of beginning, of homecoming. A kiss as warm and bright as the dawn breaking over their new world. 6 months later, spring came to the north. It was not the hesitant, muddy spring the lands had known for centuries. It was a true, riotous explosion of life. For the first time in living memory, the snows in the whispering woods melted completely, revealing a rich, dark earth beneath. Green shoots pushed their way through the soil. The skeletal pines grew soft with new needles. Birds, whose ancestors had long since fled the eternal winter, returned, their songs filling the air. The castle of Griff was no longer a fortress of ice and shadow. Cale had ordered the heavy, dark tapestries taken down, replaced with bright weavings of green and gold. The windows were thrown open to the warm, pine-scented air. The castle, once a tomb, was now alive. It was a home. Ilara stood on the balcony of their chambers, a soft breeze playing with her hair. She was no longer the shivering, starving outcast from the village. She wore a simple gown of deep forest green, the color of the new life that surrounded them. She was the Alpha Queen, and the land itself seemed to rejoice in her presence. The warmth that flowed from her was a gentle, ambient thing now, a quiet hum of life that soothed the ancient hurts of the kingdom. A pair of strong, warm arms wrapped around her from behind. Cale rested his chin on her shoulder, his own warmth a comforting presence against her back. He was a different man. The harsh, glacial beauty had softened, warmed from within. The perpetual tension in his shoulders was gone, replaced by a relaxed, easy strength. Laughter came to him easily now, a deep, rumbling sound that she loved more than anything. "What are you thinking about?" he murmured, his lips brushing her temple. "I was just listening," she said, "to the birds. I never thought I would hear them here." "They were waiting for their queen," he replied, his voice soft. He took her right hand in his, turning it over. The skin was flawless. The phantom ache, the memory of cold and shame, was gone forever. Does it ever feel strange to be without it? No, she said, curling her fingers around his. It feels like I was wearing a glove my whole life and I've only just taken it off. I'm finally feeling everything as I was meant to. Down below, in the newly planted courtyard garden, a colossal silver-white wolf lay sleeping in a patch of sun. His savage, pained energy was gone, replaced by a deep, contented peace. Children of the castle staff, who once would have fled in terror at the mere thought of him, now sometimes dared to roll a ball near him. He would open one golden eye, give a lazy flick of his tail, and go back to sleep. He was no longer a beast fighting a war within himself. His alpha was whole. His queen was home. He was at peace. Valerius sent a message, Kale said quietly, his tone hardening slightly. Ilara stiffened. The former advisor was locked in the deepest dungeon, the one Kale had promised him, a place carved from the mountain's icy heart. He begs for an audience. He says he has information about other kingdoms, conspiracies. He is a snake, Ilara said simply, turning in Kale's arms to face him. And we are done with snakes. Kale looked down at her, a fierce pride in his golden eyes. He nodded. We are. He would deal with the politics, the lingering threats from a world that was still adjusting to the shift in power in the north. But he would never again let that darkness touch her. He leaned down and kissed her. A slow, deep kiss filled with the comfortable intimacy of shared days and nights. It was a kiss that tasted of sunshine and new beginnings. I have a gift for you, he said when they broke apart. He led her back into their chambers. On a small table sat a wooden box. He opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of black velvet, was a single, perfect circlet. It was forged of silver and gold, twisted together like two vines, with a single, small, uncut diamond at its center that glowed with a soft internal light. It's beautiful, she whispered. The silver is from the mountain that guards our western border, he explained, lifting it from the box. The gold is from the river that now thaws in the east, and the diamond, they call it a dragon's tear. They are only found in the heart of volcanoes. I thought it was fitting. He placed it gently on her head. It was cool against her skin, but not cold. It felt right, as if it had been made for her. She looked at her reflection in the polished silver mirror on the wall. She saw a woman she barely recognized. Her eyes were bright, her face relaxed and happy. She saw a queen. But more than that, she saw a woman who was loved. A woman who had found her place not on a throne, but in the heart of the one man who had seen her when she was invisible to everyone else. He stood behind her, his reflection beside hers. The Alpha King and his Fire Queen, the wolf and his son. There is one more thing, he said, his voice a low, happy rumble. He placed his hands on her stomach, his large, warm palms resting gently over the green fabric. Our scouts returned from Griff this morning. Her breath caught. She had not asked about her former home. It was a place of ghosts for her. The village elder and the baker who chased you away send their profound apologies, he said, a hint of dark amusement in his tone. They also send a tribute and a request. They wish to rename the village. They want to call it Ilara's Hope. Tears welled in her eyes, tears not of sorrow, but of a profound, overwhelming catharsis. The broken, branded girl who had fled into the snow was now a symbol of hope. She turned and buried her face in his chest, her arms wrapping around his strong waist. He held her, stroking her hair. It's a new world, my love, he whispered, one we made together. She looked up at him, her face wet with happy tears. She laid her hand against his chest, feeling the steady, warm beat of his heart. She had slept against the chest of a monster and found a king. She had faced down death and found her life. She was home, and the winter was finally, truly over.